When I woke up, there was a terrible quiet. The kind of silence that makes your heart beat fast to fill the gap. The ceiling lights were too bright, making my eyes fly open as if to make up for the lack of sound. I looked around and tried to remember how I got here. Yes, the surgery. It was an appendectomy, they said. It was meant to be normal. When I tried to sit up, a sharp pain in my side made me think of the surgery I had not long ago. When I reached out for the nurse call button, my hand didn't grab anything. When I looked down, the remote was lying on the floor. Odd. As I groaned and stretched to pick it up, I pressed the button over and over. No one showed up. It felt like there was nothing in the room, and every breath I took was too loud. As I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I felt dizzy all over. As I waited for the world to stop spinning, I tried to keep my balance. When it did, I saw that my things were nicely stacked on the chair across the room. Everything was still there. My clothes, my phone, and even my cheap watch. As I put on my clothes, my hands were shaking because the hospital gown felt like a veil I was eager to shed. Next was my phone. If I tapped the screen, it would light up, but the signal bars would not show anything. Not a network. I tried to text and call everyone, but every time they tried, they failed. I slowly and horribly came to terms with what I knew. I was by myself. I stumbled to the door and flung it open, half hoping to find a busy hospital hallway. There was nothing there instead. Nothing to hear but the squeaky wheels of a medicine cart and the moving of patients. There was only a long, empty hallway with strong, clean smell of antiseptic in the air. As I walked out the door, a chill went up my spine because the flooring felt cold under my bare feet. The quiet was so heavy that it felt like it was pressing down on my chest. Each step I took toward the nurse's station was shaky. The computers were on and had screensavers that were still not set. There were papers all over the place, and a coffee cup had been knocked over, spilling its dark liquid. Hello. In the empty room, my voice echoed and sounded strange. There was no answer, only the sound of my own fear. I walked down the hall, past rooms that were empty. The beds weren't made, and some of them had dried spots that I couldn't or wouldn't figure out. It looked like someone had just thrown a wheelchair away quickly because it was on its back. I then heard it, a faraway thump. My heart jumped into my throat. I stood still and listened carefully. It came back with a number of random thumps and then a dragging sound that went away and then came back. It was enough to make me run back to my room, where I thought I would be safe. I shut the door and took a few short gasps of air. The pain in my side was no longer important to me because I was too scared to think about it. What had taken place? Where were all of you? What was that sound, though? I climbed back into bed and pulled the sheets over my head like a child hiding in their closet from monsters. But deep down, I knew that the monsters I was hiding from were not the kind of things kids fear. They were real, and they had me locked up with them. While I was lying there, a distant thump broke the silence again. It was a warning that whatever was out there was still hiding in the dark. My heart seemed to beat in time with the darkness. Or maybe it was the other way around. I ran out of things to say. It felt like fear was in the back of my throat. I had to leave my room once more. I had to find anyone. It was scarier to think about staying put and waiting for help that wasn't coming than going into the unknown. As I slowly left my room, the door behind me creaked in a scary way. The hospital had always been very busy, but right now it seemed like a graveyard. The only sounds that broke the quiet were far away, strange noises that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Every step hurt my side, so I moved slowly. The pain was a harsh warning that I was weak and open to harm. The welcome area was a mess, with papers all over the place like there had been a storm. It looked like a child's stuffed animal was looking at me with one eye. The chairs were flipped over, and magazines were torn and lying all over the waiting room. There was still a TV on, and the screen was flashing with static. I reached out and turned it off. The sudden quiet made me jump. After that, the lights went out, if only once or twice, before throwing me into darkness. I stood still and my chest hurt from holding my breath. It was very dark in the hallway because the emergency lights went on. It was just about enough to get by. I kept walking even though my steps were too loud. There were more and more clear signs of chaos. A bed was tipped over, and the sheets on it were caked with dried blood. I turned away because I didn't want to think about what could have happened to the person who was lying there. A soft crying caused my attention to be drawn to it. My heart was beating fast as I followed it. It took me to the church. Inside, the lights were still lit, and the shadows they cast across the room were beautiful. I walked in and heard the sound of whimpering stop. It turned out to be the wind blowing through a broken window. I could feel myself starting to cry. This is not likely to happen. Not this. Hospitals should be safe, full of life, and places where people can get better. The feeling of being watched crept over me as I left the church. I turned around, but all I could see was the empty, red-lit hallway. It was clear that there was going to be bloodshed as I went further. Doors were broken off their hinges, and the contents of a vending machine were stolen. The blood was all over the place. It was on the floor and on the walls. I slipped and hit the wall, and my hand was wet and red when I took it out. I got to the lifts and pushed the button, but it didn't work. There's nothing. The stairs back then. When I opened the door to the stairs, the metal clang sounded like a gunshot. The sounds got louder and clearer as I went down. I could hear things moving around and growling like something wet being dragged. Images I didn't want to see came into my mind. Horrible things I wouldn't let myself fully form. When I got to the first floor, I looked through the door's window. The lobby was wrecked, and the furniture was broken and strewn around. In the shadows, there were shapes moving too quickly to be people. As I moved away from the door, I let out sharp gasps of air. I had to hide and find a place to wait it out. Inside the administration building, there would be a place I could lock myself in. It was loud for me to hear my own movements, and the growling sounds behind me were getting louder. I was afraid to look back. I was unable to. I was sure I couldn't move again if I saw what was after me. When I got to the offices, I threw myself inside and locked the door by slamming it shut. As I slid down against it, my heart was beating fast, and my breath was short. For now, I felt safe. Outside, though, the hospital had gone crazy, and I was stuck in the middle of it all. I sat with my back against the cold, hard office door. The darkness was like a shroud, heavy and smothering. The little light that got through the cracks looked like it was being sucked up by the shadows, dancing just outside my safe space. Every weak breath I took made me think of the surgery that had put me in this terrible place. I could not stay here. My mind kept going back to that thought, telling me to move and do something. Anything. As I cracked the door open, I could see a thin strip of red light from the emergency lights. The hallway seemed peaceful, but the silence was actually a threat, coming from somewhere in the hospital I couldn't see. I stepped outside, and the cold tile felt good on my bare feet. Each step made a soft thud in the otherwise quiet hall. The sounds from before were gone, and in their place was a silence that was scarier in some way. It was the quiet before the storm, or the deep breath before the jump. My hands were shaking as I moved forward slowly, my eyes darting to every shadow and flicker of movement. There were more obvious signs of chaos here. A gurney was lying on its side, and its wheels were still turning slowly. There were macabre streaks of blood on the wall, making it look like a grotesque work of art in the Hall of the Damned. I heard it then, the soft, wet sound of skin being torn, the crack of bone, and the low, guttural moans of something not human. Too close. I hid in a nearby room because my heart was beating so hard against my chest that it felt like it was going to burst. In the door's small, square window, I could see them. Their bodies were bent and broken, and they moved in ways that didn't make sense for their bodies. Their skin was a sickly pale color, and was pulled tight over bones that stuck out. Their milky, dead eyes, on the other hand, were what held me hostage. I was hungry all the time. I tried not to gasp and quickly put my hand to my mouth to stop myself. One of them stopped and snapped its head toward where I was hidden. Its mouth was covered in blood, and pieces of meat stuck to its jowls. When it took a step toward me, my reflexes to stay alive went off. I slid deeper into the room and hid behind a curtain. My whole body was shaking. The scary thing was now at the door, wrapping its gross fingers around the frame. I prayed to a God I had never believed in while holding my breath. I was making a deal for a life I had not yet lived. The thing stayed for a moment longer, its head tilted as if it were confused, until a sound from down the hall scared it away. That sound saved me. I waited and counted every second and heartbeat until the stumbling, dragging steps stopped. When the quiet came back, it was different. It was filled with the sounds of the creatures. I knew then that I couldn't hide for much longer. I had to get away before they came back or found me. So I had to move. Even though my legs were weak, I came out from where I was hidden. My goal in light in the dark was the service exit. I got there by avoiding the main hallways and instead using the service rooms and back ways I knew from all the times I had been there before. But I didn't go right away when I got to the exit. The door was open, letting the night air in with the crazy sounds of the world outside. Along with the sound of sirens and fires, people were screaming in fear. That's when I realized the horror wasn't just in the hospital. Like a cancer, it had spread through the city and the world. I wasn't running away to safety. I was running away from a different kind of danger. I moved away from the door and found a hidden alcove where a vending machine used to be. It was a short break that gave me time to gather my confidence and thoughts. I chose to wait until the first light of dawn. The animals might have been afraid of the light. Could be. But in this new world, there were no sure things. The only harsh truth was that I was by myself, being chased, and a long way from safety. The hospital windows were dirty, so the first light of dawn came in as a gray whisper. I hadn't really slept. Every shade and sound had woken me up, making my heart race. But the dawn brought a weak courage and the will to stay alive in this place. I slowly crept out of my hiding place. My muscles were stiff and sore, and my side hurt all the time. The hospital was quiet now. The scary things that come out at night seemed to have gone back to their dark places. I went back to the service exit, but this time the door was still open, and I didn't know what was outside. That's when I heard him, a soft murmur and the sound of keys. The sound of another person's voice scared and excited me at the same time. I went after the noise and found a room for the cleaners. The door was only slightly open, and an old guy with a baseball bat in his hands was talking to himself inside. "Hello," I whispered and opened the door more. After being scared, he turned around with wide eyes. "Oh, thank God," he said in a low voice. I thought I was the only one left. He was a cleaner named Harold, and he was on the night shift when everything went wrong. He told me about the freaks that had come and how the hospital had become a mess. Along with me, he had hid in hopes of a miracle. I said, "We need to get out," and the alarm in my voice made it clear. He agreed, but his face was sad. There is a tunnel for maintenance that leads to the old boiler room. This is a way to get away from the big sites. They're still here, so we need to be careful. We came up with a wild plan to get away. I would follow Harold with my homemade weapon, a fire extinguisher in my hand. Harold would lead the way with his bat. Our path through the hospital kept us away from the main hallways, where the animals liked to hang out. It was smoky and crowded in the repair tunnel. People who get cramped would hate it, but it was our only way to get out alive. The boiler room was big and dark, and the boilers stood there silently in the darkness. Now we could see the way out, a metal door that led to the outside. We were really close. That's when the attack began. They were quick and quiet as they came out of the shadows. With a grunt, Harold swung his bat, and it hit the ball with a terrible crunch. I sprayed it with a fire extinguisher, and the cold blast stopped it in its tracks. We fought like animals in a tight spot, desperate and scared to death. The will to live drove our swings and thrusts, but there were too many of them, and they pushed us back into a corner. Then, with one last superhuman effort, Harold smashed away to the door. We rushed through it and into the early morning sunlight. We kept running until the hospital was just a shadow in the early morning light. We passed out on the grass, our bodies hurting but still alive, still alive. But as soon as we caught our breath, the sounds of chaos came through. Sirens, screams, and the clear groans of the animals. It had spread, and now the whole city was sick. We got out of the hospital, but the horror was still there. It's always seemed to me that society was just a thin layer on top of chaos, like a fragile bubble ready to pop. If you're reading this, my name is Alex, and you already know I was right. People don't usually talk to me like that. I saw the storm coming while everyone else was lying in the sun. Since I was old enough to know that everything could change in an instant, I've been getting ready. My bunker, my safe place, was the result of years of careful planning and quiet fear. It was hidden deep in the woods by nature and was meant to be unnoticeable to the untrained eye. It was my safe place to be alone. For defense, I had weapons and books to keep me sane. I also had enough food and drink to last a siege. Anything was fine with me. I was ready for nuclear fallout, EMP hits, more. But what about this? I never made plans for the end of the world being overrun by zombies. What the hell did they think? The first signs of trouble did not come from the disaster alert system or a government message. No. The internet was the first place where people talked about a new threat. A thread here, an email that got out there, whispers at first, then panicked voices, and finally a wild noise of fear. I had a digital front row seat to the end of society as I watched it all happen on my monitors. I remember the last show I watched before the TVs turned off. As he read the prompter, the anchor was shaking with fear and sweat. His voice was a mix of shock and denial. Do not go outside. Stay away from people who are sick. What the military? He stopped and looked away from the camera. That's when I heard it. The chaos, screams, and clear moans that would soon be the background music for our deaths. It was over when the screen went blank. You can live through the end of the world in each. I turned off the screens. I was no longer in need of them. The comms around my property gave me a good look at the nightmare that was about to happen. At dusk, the first zombies to show up in the clearing. Their bodies were horrifying proof of what the virus did to bones and skin. I used night vision to watch as they walked around randomly until they suddenly turned their heads toward my bunker, as if they could smell my blood from miles away. I looked over my guns and counted my bullets. Even though I wasn't a fighter, I knew how to fight and stay alive. I was going to do that. Get by. The only sounds in the bunker were the generator's hum and the moans of the dead, getting closer and closer. I was lying in my bed and looking at the steel ceiling. I knew I wasn't going to fall asleep. Yes, I was ready for a disaster. But what happened was quite different. A beast with teeth that grind together and skin that rots. As the first night of the new world came, I understood that no amount of planning can prepare you for the fear of what's to come or the feeling of being hunted. I was about to find out if I really was as good as I said I would be. Before the chaos, there was peace. There was a storm. In the bunker, the only thing that told the time was when the sun rose and set. Food, drink, and entertainment were all there for me. But the silence of being alone was a constant enemy. The buzzing on the dead radio would often make me listen to it, just to hear a sound that was made by people. Through my cameras, I looked at the world outside. The dead were always there, a sea of decay that crashed through my barriers like desperate waves. In a strange way, I felt good about knowing I was right and that all my work had not been for nothing. But the smugness was quickly ruined by the fear of the real world. It was just the two of me. I saw a group on the perimeter cams one morning, or maybe it was evening. I couldn't tell the time. One in a few people are still alive. They were a ragged group that moved quickly, like people who are being chased. They had seen my screens and gates. It was a sign of hope and a chance to find safety for them. For me, they were a danger to my life and a hole in my thought, out plans. I watched them for hours as they set up camp out of sight. They were smart and careful. They were aware of how dangerous the world they lived in was. In times of need, though, people may do stupid things. Not long after, they walked up to the bunker, their eyes hungry not for food, but for a way out. I first told them to stay away, using my voice to send a message through the speakers. They begged to be let in and for help. I said no. I wasn't willing to risk it. I had planned for just one, not for a group. I could only spend so much on resources, and trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. At that point, the need turned into anger. When what they said didn't work, they got violent. They yelled and cursed my name. They tried to attack the cave, but steel and concrete made it impossible. But they didn't give up. The basic need to live drove them. The fight was very rough, even though I was on top, which gave me the upper hand. Every shot from my gun made my mouth hurt. They used to be people with lives and families, but now they are just wild. At first, I didn't mean to kill them, but when one got past the back wall, I had no choice. It was either him or me. I picked myself. After the gunfire stopped, there was a heavier quiet than before. At the edge of the forest, bodies were lying in a mess, a stark reflection of the New World Order. Along with one other person, I pulled them deeper into the woods, away from my house. That night and the next night, I didn't sleep. Their looks scared me because they made me think of who they might have been before the world went bad. The bunker, which used to be my proud stronghold, now felt like a grave. I was still living, but at what cost? I was more scared of the live than the dead outside. People, not the zombies, were the real unknown. In their fight to stay alive, they could do anything. At that point, I understood that no amount of planning could have made me ready for this. The real enemy wasn't the virus or the zombies. It was us, the survivors, the last people left on Earth. As I made my shield stronger, I knew the next fight would be even worse. There was no way for me to see the bottom of this slide into chaos. The bunker had turned into a tomb made of steel and concrete, and the air smelled old from the metal and gunfire. Being buried with the sounds of the people I'd killed, I couldn't stay there. There was a survivalist shop not too far away that had what I needed. After running away from the world, it was time to face it. It felt like I was in a different world when I went outside. The air was heavy with decay, and the trees that she used to know were now a maze of shadows and dangers. The way to the store was a maze, and I could feel the heavy gaze of eyes that I couldn't see. It was full of the dead, but they weren't the shambling bodies you see in horror movies. They were even worse. They were even worse. They moved in a creepy, fluid way that made my blood chill. They were quiet predators. Survivalists like me saw the store as a shelter and a safe place to be before the end of the world. It should have been safe. But when I got there, I saw complete destruction. The dead were inside, and the living were making their last fight. By the barriers, the empty shells, and the blood. So much blood, I knew. I walked down the aisles, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to show me each scary scene. The bodies were jumbled up with the broken shelves, and the people's faces were frozen with fear. I was there to get groceries, but I was really there to do penance. People used to live outside, but the dead here were my family and friends. I got the most important things I could. I was almost ready to leave when I heard it. The clear sound of a child crying. Like an animal in a cage, my heart was beating hard against my ribs. I went after the sound and found a boy of about 10 years old huddled in a locked storage room. And he was the only one in this hell. I had to stay with him. The survivalist in me thought about the risk, the extra person to feed, the noise, and the responsibility. But the part of me that was still human and hopeful knew I had to take him with me. Together with the boy, whose name I found out was Ethan, we made it back to the bunker. He didn't say much, and I didn't ask him anything. We both had seen too much, and the silence meant that we both agreed not to talk about the horrible things we had seen. As I lay awake that night, listening to Ethan's slow breaths, I knew the harsh truth. My plans, my bunker, and my guns were all just false signs that I was in charge. The real world was outside my steel doors, and it was a lot messier and scarier than I thought it would be. The dead changed the rules, so I had to too in order to keep us living. The hard truth was that being ready wasn't enough to survive. It was about being able to change. Doing whatever it took was important, not just to stay alive, but also to hold on to some semblance of humanity. As dawn came up and cast a gray light through the telescope, I chose what to do. I wouldn't just make it through the end of the world. I was going to make sure Ethan and I lived through it. Things were going badly in the world, but I was not going to let that be our end. The days after the store were a blur of being on high alert and having bad dreams in private. The boy I had found, Ethan, became my shadow. Having him around always made me think about what was at stake. The world outside the bunker was a relentless beast that kept scratching at our door and screaming for our blood. But we were able to stay alive. The event took place during a shopping run. They were all around us. Nothing stupid like the dead, but something much worse. They were different now. Their eyes weren't blank anymore. They were learning, hunting, and figuring things out. It was a trick. When they came, we were foraging in the middle of town. Not walking slowly, but quickly. Not wail, but quiet. The living dead were changing, and we were their targets. When I grabbed Ethan's hand, we ran and ducked into what used to be a diner, but is now a tomb for a normal life that has been lost. The horde was on us in seconds, and their bodies were a wave of rotting and angry bodies. As I turned to face them, I pushed Ethan under a table. Even though my gun was steady, my heart was racing with fear. They charged at me with the fierceness of hunters, not the awkward swipes of the dead. I fired. Each shot was a prayer, and each hit was a short respite. They were learning how to deal with my strategies. When I moved to my knives, I cut them close, and the blood was hot on my skin. This dance of death was very real. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a natural force, a hurricane of life. Then, when my arms got heavy and my body started to scream in pain, a miracle happened. The sound of engines and the light flashing on cars. Others had shown up, not to save me, but because they needed materials. When they came, it was a break and a chance. I grabbed Ethan and we ran away like ghosts in the crowd. We finally got back to the bunker, and the door shut with such a heavy sound that it shook me to my core. I was still living. We were still living. They were still living. There was change in the world, though, and we had to adapt to it. I knew this was just the start as I stitched up our cuts and scrapes. As the dead changed, so did we. To stay alive, we had to stay one step ahead. The cave was a cage instead of a safe place. We had to get away, find other people, and start building a life, not just a way to stay alive. When Ethan looked into my eyes, there was a quiet understanding between us. We were the survivors, the new world. We would take back a world that had been taken over by the dead. The living dead may be changing, but so were we. There was no way we were going to die, and we weren't going to go gently into that dark night. The world was cruel, merciless, and never-ending. But I was too. Ethan was too. Every breath we took and every heartbeat was the same. We were the strong, unchanging spirit of people. This is not the end of the story. It's not possible, because staying alive is a process, not a goal. And ours was just getting started. The dawn barely breaks anymore. The sun seems as wary of this new world as we are. My name is Mike. Not that names mean much anymore. We're all just survivors, or we're not. I'm a sweeper, part of a squad that's been tasked with the dirty work of reclaiming the city, block by bloody block. Our base is a fortress of concrete and steel, a relic of a time when people worried about things like office space and parking spots. Now, it's where we gear up, load out, and try not to think too much about what's waiting for us out there. I strap on my Kevlar vest like it's second nature. The weight familiar and oddly comforting. My rifle, a scratched and worn R-15, feels like an extension of my own body. We don't bother with names on the gear. What's the point when you're just going to see it splattered with gore by the end of the day? The briefing room is stark, a single map on the wall, with zones marked in red for infested, green for clear, and yellow for in progress. Today, we're heading into a red zone. It's been red for too long, and Command wants it green, no matter the cost. Our squad leader, a grizzled vet named Carter, doesn't bother with pep talks. He just gives us the coordinates and reminds us of the rules. Double tap to the head. Keep your distance, and never, ever get cornered. We move out at 600, the streets deserted and silent as a grave. The city is a husk, buildings gutted by fire, and windows gaping like dead eyes. We've become accustomed to the stench of stench, a way the silence is never quite silent, filled with the soft moans and shuffling of the dead. Clearing zones is methodical, brutal work. We sweep through buildings, room by room, our boots crunching on shattered glass and spent casings. The zombies are predictable at least. They hear us coming, and they come for us, all hunger and no thought. We put them down, one by one, the crack of gunfire and the wet thud of bullets hitting flesh, a grim chorus. I used to feel something when I did this. Horror, pity, even anger. Now, there's just a numbness, a hollow space where my humanity used to be. I see them, the zombies, and they're just targets. I don't think about who they were, who they might have been before the world turned upside down. We clear a small apartment building by midday, the bodies piled high in the courtyard. We're efficient, our movements honed by countless hours of combat. But even as we burn the corpses, a part of me wonders how long we can keep doing this. How many more zones can we clear before there's no one left to save? As the smoke rises into the gray sky, I catch a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure standing still amidst the chaos. It's gone when I blink, and I tell myself it was just a trick of the light. But in this new world, you learn to trust your instincts, and mine are screaming that something is very, very wrong. We head back to base as the sun sets, a red smear on the horizon. Tomorrow, we'll do it all over again. But tonight, I'll clean my rifle and try not to dream of dead eyes and hungry mouths. Because that's the routine, and the routine is all that's keeping us from becoming like them. Yesterday's sweep was like any other, but today, the air feels different, charged with a tension that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I've seen things that would make most people lose their minds, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered today. We were back in the red zone, a part of the city that's become a concrete jungle of death. The buildings loom over us, silent sentinels to the chaos that once ruled the streets. Our boots move in sync, a rhythm we've all become accustomed to. But today, that rhythm was broken. It started with a scream, a sound so human, so filled with terror that it pierced through the numbness I've wrapped around myself like armor. We followed the sound, guns raised, expecting to find a survivor. Instead, we found it, a zombie, but not like any we'd seen before. This one was different. Its eyes weren't clouded over with the milky film of death. They were clear, almost. Intelligent. It watched us, head cocked to the side like a curious animal. We hesitated, and that was our first mistake. It moved with a speed that was unnatural, darting among us like a shadow. We fired, but it was as if it knew where we'd aim before we did. The second mistake was splitting up. Carter shouted orders, trying to flank it. But in the chaos, we lost sight of it, and each other. The screams started again. Not just one this time, but many. I found Jenkins first, or what was left of him. His eyes were wide open in shock, and I couldn't help but wonder if he'd seen something in that creature's eyes before it tore him apart. One by one, we found the others, all dead, all with that same look of horror etched onto their faces. It was a massacre, the kind that would have sent any sane person running for their life. But we're sweepers. We don't run, we don't hide, and we don't leave our dead behind. I regrouped with the few of us that were left, and we tracked the creature, following the blood and the destruction it left in its wake. It was toying with us, drawing us deeper into the heart of the red zone. We cornered it in an old supermarket, aisles of rotting food and broken shelves making a maze that it navigated with ease. I caught a glimpse of it, the way its muscles moved under its pale, decaying skin, and I felt fear, real fear, not the adrenaline rush of combat or the cold dread of the undead, but a primal terror that clawed at my gut. It could have killed us then, but it didn't. It just stood there, watching us with those unnerving eyes before slipping away into the shadows. We were left with the echoing silence and the dead. As we made our way back to base, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The rules of the game were different now, and we were no longer the hunters in this twisted world. We were the prey. I should be dead, but I'm not. I'm alive. And I have to warn the others. There's something new out there. Something worse than the zombies we thought we knew. And the scariest part, I think it's learning, evolving, becoming something we can't predict or understand. Tonight, I'll clean my rifle, and I'll try to convince myself that what I saw was just a fluke, an aberration. But in the pit of my stomach, I know the truth. The undead are no longer mindless, and our war just became a lot more complicated. The night was a cacophony of the undead's moans and the living's whispered fears. Sleep was a stranger to us, as distant as the memory of a world without horror. After the encounter with that anomaly, the creature that hunted us, I lay awake, grappling with the dread that we were no longer the apex predators in this concrete wilderness. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the decaying city, we received new orders. Intel had come through about a group of survivors, holed up in what was once a fortified high school. They called it a haven, a sanctuary. But in this world, I've learned that hope is often just a prelude to disappointment. The journey to the school was a descent into the belly of the beast. The streets, once veins pumping with the lifeblood of the city, were now clogged with the undead. We moved in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own fears. The loss of Michaels yesterday hadn't just been a blow to our numbers. It was a crack in the armor of our resolve. We reached the outskirts of the school's location by midday. The building stood like a fortress, its barricaded gates and boarded windows, a testament to the survivors' will to live. But the mass of zombies that surrounded it was a writhing testament to the persistence of death. The fight to the school doors was a symphony of gunfire, screams, and the sickening crunch of bone. We were a whirlwind of destruction, and for every one of us, there seemed to be 100 of them. But desperation lent us strength, and a thought of what lay beyond those doors drove us forward. The survivors pulled us inside, a mix of gratitude and terror in their eyes. They were a diverse group, clinging to the remnants of civilization, They had turned classrooms into sanctuaries, corridors into lifelines, and the gym into a communal heart that now beat with the pulse of the frightened, but not yet defeated. Their leader, Sarah, had eyes that had seen too much, yet still flickered with the flame of leadership. She spoke of their struggles, their losses, and their determination to hold on until help arrived. But as she spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on a precipice, and the abyss was staring back at us. The barricades wouldn't hold for long. The undead were relentless, their numbers inexhaustible. As they breached our makeshift defenses, the gym became an arena, and we unwilling gladiators. The brutality was unimaginable, a dance with death that left no room for hesitation. In the midst of the carnage, a door at the back of the gym caught my eye. It was out of place, its sturdy build incongruous with the rest of the school's architecture. Driven by a mixture of instinct and the need to understand, I fought my way towards it, each step a battle against the tide of death. I reached the door, my hands slick with the blood of the undead. With a heave, I opened it, bracing myself for what I might find. The sight that greeted me was one of cold, scientific calculation, and in that moment, I understood the true nature of our mission. This was no haven. It was the heart of our nightmare, a Pandora's box masquerading as hope. And as the realization set in, I knew that the fight for survival had taken on a new, more sinister edge. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Amidst the chaos of our last stand in the gym, I had stumbled upon the epicenter of our despair. The room beyond was a laboratory, sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked battleground I had just left behind. The truth lay bare before me, a cruel mockery of our desperate fight for survival. The survivors, the ones we had fought to protect, had been experimenting in a desperate bid to reverse the infection. Instead, they had birthed a new kind of monstrosity. Sarah, the leader of the survivors, appeared beside me, her gaze heavy with secrets now exposed. "We were trying to stop it," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the groans of the encroaching dead. "We never meant for it to go this far." The creature we had encountered, the one with human eyes, was their doing, a test subject that had escaped. This revelation shook me to my core. The lines between friend and foe, between human and monster, had been irrevocably blurred. The lab was a tomb of good intentions, and as the undead finally broke through our last defenses, I knew we couldn't stay. Sarah's hand gripped mine, her touch a plea for forgiveness and a call to action. We had to escape, to survive, to face the consequences of humanity's hubris. We fled through the back corridors of the school, the sounds of pursuit a constant companion. The survivors were with us, their faces etched with guilt and fear. We were a motley procession of the damned seeking redemption in a city of the dead. The escape was brutal. We fought for every breath, every step. The dead were relentless, and in their mindless hunger, they cared not for the sins of the living. We lost more people, each death a weight added to my soul. As we emerged into the dying light of day, the city lay before us, a wasteland of what once was. The air was filled with the acrid scent of burning flesh, the smoke rising from the school behind us, as it became a pyre for the dead and the secrets it once held. We didn't stop running until the school was nothing but a speck on the horizon. Only then did we allow ourselves a moment of respite, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, our bodies on the verge of collapse. Sarah stood among us, her eyes searching the group for absolution. "What now?" she asked, her voice a broken thing. I looked at the faces of those who had survived, at the city that had become our tomb, and I felt the weight of the truth settle around me. Now, we find a way to live with what we've done, and we keep fighting, because that's all we have left. The road ahead was uncertain, a path fraught with dangers, both familiar and unknown. but we would face it together, the remnants of humanity bound by our shared sins and our will to survive. As night fell and the first stars dared to pierce the veil of darkness, I realized the fight against the undead was far more than a battle for survival. It was a fight for our very humanity, and it was a fight we couldn't afford to lose. I've always loved the outdoors, but that camping trip forever tainted its beauty for me. The serene lake shimmered, reflecting the dense woods surrounding it. Birds chirped, the wind whispered, and everything seemed perfect as we set up camp. Me and my friends, Mike, Jess, and Lucy, looked forward to this trip for months. The first night was a blend of campfire tales, roasted marshmallows, and soft guitar melodies. It was pure bliss. But things took a dark turn the next morning when Jess found a bloodied backpack near our site. We dismissed it as some animal attack. Oh, how wrong we were. By the third day, things were noticeably strange. Trails seemed to loop back on themselves, leading us in circles. The forest noises grew eerier. We stumbled upon abandoned tents, some ripped apart, with belongings scattered. That night, while the others slept, I heard soft murmurs, footsteps around our tent. It wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic. Gripped with fear, I peeked out. What I saw will haunt my dreams forever. Two figures, with rotting skin and lifeless eyes, were sniffing around. One had a ranger hat, the other hiking boots. The undead. Panic set in. We decided to stay awake and keep a lookout. By dawn, Mike was gone. There were signs of a struggle, but no trace of him. The forest was no longer our escape. It was our prison. We had to strategize. Jess, being the practical one, suggested setting up traps around our tent using ropes and branches. Lucy, still shaken by Mike's disappearance, agreed to whatever we proposed. The following nights were brutal. Every time a trap snapped, a chilling scream echoed, signaling another zombie hiker or ranger caught. Despite our precautions, they seemed to multiply. One evening, as we gathered wood, a horde ambushed us. In the chaos, Jess got bitten. We had heard stories. A bite meant transformation. She pleaded with us to leave her, and we did, with heavy hearts. Days turned to nights, and our food dwindled. Each passing hour was torture. Lucy became sick from drinking unfiltered water. I watched, helpless, as she grew weak and finally stopped moving. It was just me, surrounded by zombies and the memories of my friends. One morning, I devised an escape plan. Using all our leftover food, I created a diversion, drawing the zombies to one side of the forest. With a heavy stick as my weapon and hope as my guide, I sprinted towards the forest's edge. It seemed endless. Every rustle, every shadow seemed like a threat, but determination fueled me. After what felt like hours, I broke free, finding myself on a highway. A passing car stopped and a kind stranger helped me in. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, once a symbol of adventure, now a graveyard for my friends. Everything was perfect. The mansion, drenched in warm sunset hues, shimmered with fairy lights. Guests in elegant dresses and sharp tuxedos chatted, awaiting the main event. Today, I, Elijah, would marry the love of my life, Jacob. But the joy was short-lived when Mara, my ex-best friend, whom I hadn't invited due to a betrayal years ago, appeared. The tension was palpable, but I tried to shake off the unease. This was my day, and nothing would ruin it. Or so I thought. Soon after Mara's arrival, things took a sinister turn. Uncle Joe, who was merrily sipping his drink one moment, suddenly lunged at Aunt Mary the next, biting into her neck. Chaos erupted. The once lively wedding tunes were now drowned by screams of horror. A horde of undead guests with lifeless eyes and rotting flesh invaded the venue. Desperate attempts to fend them off proved futile. My bridesmaids, Overwhelmed, fell prey one by one. My father, trying to protect my mother, got swarmed. The horrifying reality hit me. My wedding had become a death trap. Jacob and I, holding hands, tried to find an escape, but in the commotion, we got separated. My heart pounded as I hid, praying he was safe. Hours felt like days. When the coast seemed clear, I ventured out. The mansion, once full of laughter and joy, was now smeared with blood and littered with bodies. The weight of grief threatened to crush me. Seeking refuge in the mansion's old chapel, I stumbled upon a sight that froze my blood. Mara, chanting in front of a bizarre altar adorned with symbols, surrounded by a few undead. To my horror, I realized she had invoked some dark ritual, turning the guests into monsters. Consumed by rage and heartbreak, our feud had driven her to this madness. Our eyes met and a fight ensued. Using a broken candle stand, I managed to fend her off, but the undead closed in, left with no choice. I barricaded myself in the chapel's attic. Days passed, dehydrated, starving, and on the brink of sanity, I finally decided to risk an escape. Creeping out, I found the mansion deserted, the undead gone, likely lured by some distant noise. I limped away, battered and broken. The mansion, a symbol of my love story, now stood as a haunting reminder of that horrific day. I never found Jacob. The trauma changed me. I survived. Yes, but the cost? My happiness, my loved ones, and my sanity.